Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Okay. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining. It's the final session of Gregg Henriques' 21st century version of wisdom. Holy crap. Can't believe it's been a month since we got this going. Today's going to be 90 minutes. It's mostly going to be us jamming with Gregg, asking questions. The previous lectures were more lecture heavy, and this one's going to be more about discussion. So just from me, please, if you have questions, write them into the chat. Put a Q or question before so I can see it. +1 if you like it, +2, so that way I can look for +2s or +3s, etc. To find the most upvoted questions. If you don't want this showing up on YouTube, because this is being recorded, then just let me know. Say, hey, please read out for me, and I'll take care of that. This is going to run for 90 minutes. In the past, Gregg has been nice enough. We've turned off the recording and just kind of hung out. We, have a little bit of a transition there. That might happen again today. But Gregg, please take it away.
All right, Anshan. Hey, man, thanks for hosting me. I really appreciate your time, and I'm glad that we've gotten to know each other better in the last month. So yeah, today's definitely more of a conversation. What I thought I would do just to set the frame is to give a little bit of summary where we've been, especially in case some folks, haven't seen the others, and then let you know kind of some thoughts about maybe sparking what this conversation could look like. But again, it's intentionally open-ended so that we can see what's most alive for us here on the knife's edge. So I'll go ahead and share my screen, which means you have to, Anjan, you got to make me co-host if you would. Okay, I think so. So yeah, just to situate us over what we've done, the first 3 episodes. I love that, episodes. All right. So episode 1 was sort of like, are we going to take a tour of the garden? And I flashed through that, if you remember. Did a flashbang approach to the garden, and I'm sure everybody got all the nuance of that. We then backed up and went ahead and said, wait a minute, actually, let's do some orienting. And the tree of knowledge really is the sort of the first gateway, the gateway drug into the garden, as it were. And so we looked at what this is, how I sort of stumbled across it, why in some ways it's sort of a conventional map of big history, and certainly corresponds to great chain of being visions, but also why it's kind of unique and different. And especially those 4 cones, the joint points, and the relationship that matter, life, mind, and culture is purported to then have with the physical, biological, psychological, and social sciences. Then the next week I came in a little hypomanic, if you remember that. I was talking fast and all excited, sharing about the updated tripartite model and the second branch on the tree, which is the justification systems theory, which provides an argument and frame for understanding what happens when language hits a tipping point of propositions and question-answer dynamics. And that then shapes our propositional knowing system and our ego, our internal narrator, and the relationship it has with both our experiential domain and our public self. And that insight allows us to upgrade and update Freud's key insights and offer a new map of human consciousness. And that new map says, yes, we have a contained phenomenological self. We have a private narrating self. We have a verbal public self. And importantly, not only those domains, but we can start to think seriously about the dynamic interrelations between those domains so that there is an attentional filter between what gets put onto the screen of consciousness. There's a Freudian filter and that tension between what your ego allows you to be aware of and what may be filtered out, repressed versus rationalized. You can think about what's let through the filter of the experiential consciousness, what gets repressed, meaning pushed off the stage and blocked and inhibited, and what is rationalized into the ego narrator. And then finally, the Rogerian filter. What do you want to share with whom, and what don't you want to share, and the process by which you navigate your public and private narration. And so we can then put this in a larger context. This is what's good, then a two-person model, and then go up the scale, the socio-ecological scale, and really think, the argument is that we can think about culture writ large as the context of justification, and the ideologies and laws and values and stories, and the capital C culture refers to the systems of justification that coordinate people. And so what you've got there is an evolutionary frame, a human psychological frame, a sociological, cultural, anthropological, and sociological frame that ties a number of things together. Then we took a little bit of a left turn and said, well, where's this idea coming from? And it's deeply connected to a problem of modernity. I talked about what's called the Enlightenment gap. Enlightenment gap was the idea that modernity didn't really have a good framework for understanding the mind versus matter problem, or more typically mind-body problem. And it didn't really have a good frame to understand scientific knowledge relative to social knowledge. You see that most obviously in the postmodern critique of that. Well, if it can't really define what mind is relative to matter, and it doesn't really know what social is relative to scientific knowledge is relative to social, it actually follows that you really can't define the field of psychology, which tries to be the field, the science of mind, or science of mind and behavior. But if you don't know the field like I do, you know that that's impossible, or at least it's claimed to be impossible. In fact, the field has long given up on trying to be a coherent science. So that was set the stage for some of the work that I'm currently doing on defining the domains of mental process. We flashed through this pretty quick, but I argued that actually the first thing that you want to do is be aware of epistemology, that is the position, whether you're taking a third person or first person vantage point in the world. And once you are correct for, or have a frame for proper epistemological vantage point, you can then identify five different domains of mind, actually 3 broad domains, and 2 of which get divided further. So one is a neurocognitive functionalist, meaning of the mind as the information stored and processed in the nervous system. Another is the behavioral definition of mind, the overt activity of what you can observe, the functional awareness and responses that you can observe that animals give, that can be just seen from a third person perspective, the way an animal functionally responds to the environment. Then there's a question of what's inside, what's it like to be a bat, is a famous Nagel, a book by Thomas Nagel, articulates the problem of subjectivity, why it is very hard to see across the epistemological gap. There's also an ontological explanatory gap here that says, yeah, we don't exactly know how the activity of the nervous system gives rise to the first person experience of being. I mentioned that John Vervaeke and I are exploring this in Untangling the World Knot. That's mind 2. Finally, there's a thing called mind 3, the private narrator that you have. I was asked on a listserv today, how do you know that mind 3 is really all that different than mind 2? And the answer is actually, well, it changes a lot because you can share it right away just by talking. Okay. So from language to speech means that it's a conduit, a highway, right out into the world, right through the skin. So you have direct access to my private justifications to the extent that I'm willing to share them. You'd never get direct access to my phenomenology. And that's a big difference. Okay. And then you feel that all the time. It's like, well, what's secrets? You don't ever have to worry about, oh my God, I wonder if somebody else will experience red the way I do. That will never leak out. You don't have to lock that in a diary. But if you narrate that you have a crush on somebody or you hate somebody and you don't want other people to know, you got to lock that away in a diary because other people have access to that thought. This is the map of mind 1, 2, 3. I also made an illusion. I didn't talk about it that much, but part of my theory is about the human relationship system. And it suggests, if we pay attention to the old saying, wise are the eyes as the in windows to the soul, that there may be an intersubjective space, okay, that you can build with individuals through a participatory dance that may not be direct phenomenology, but it actually creates a shared intersubjective participatory space. And thus, I'm exploring the concept of mind to be. And I encourage you to think about the intimate people you know. If you've been in a long-term partner relationship or your parents, people that you know really well, think about how much you share and really can see them and be them in certain ways, in a deep and modeling way. So that's kind of what I'm getting at there. And then it was like, well, Greg, you've got all this analytics stuff. That's cool at some level, but what can we say in relationship to a practical meta-psychology? And then I was very fortunate. We were fortunate, I think, so that Zach Stein, and it happened to be that Jordan Hall was hanging. So they popped in, and I said, hey, if you look at Zach Stein's big meta-psychology and you situate it between our time between worlds and think about the collection of skill development and transcendence and ensoulment as big three categories, you really have a nice frame of reference for this day and age for what it takes to build whole humans and the lines of development across those three areas. So we were happy to have some of that conversation. So we're going to then build off of that today in conversational form with the, kind of brainstorm title of Meta-Psych Tech. Okay. This is a nod to the relation from Zach Stein into Jordan Hall and John Vervaeke. If you know the conversations that John Vervaeke and Jordan Hall were having, John was building an ecology of practices, psychotechnologies. Then he was syncing up with Jordan Hall, talking about coherence. And the two of them were like, hey, we need a meta-psychology to bring coherence to the ecology of practice. So that's the idea. That was something that resonated quite significantly with me. And so as we come to sort of like, okay, well, now at the cusp, this theory of knowledge system that I developed can really be summarized by sort of 8 key words of knowledge, justification, investment, and influence, adaptation and development, well-being, and mindfulness. And the idea is with that weave, we can orient toward a vision and a set of practices for wisdom. So now what I'd like to do at this sort of end, and this is a little bit not formatted perfectly, and I'm going to blame Anjan for this completely because he kept asking me questions and didn't give me time to prep this. Now, notice how you love externalizing blaming of others when you should have been responsible. I love that technique. But seriously, I'm going to now throw out some questions, 6 questions to prime you guys. And of course, these are just then brainstorming questions. I just happened to see Forrest Landry was doing his ephemeral group process where the emphasis is on question generation. So let's spend some time then with some questions. This first question was a variant of what I showed up to Daniel Schmachtenberger's 4th digital porch. And I was trying to nudge Peter Lindbergh to get me to ask a question, but he brushed me off and I never got to ask Daniel a question. But this was the question I wanted to ask. What was your learning experience is doing therapy? What did you make of the competing perspectives in the world of psychotherapy? Because I know Daniel has counseling experience. Did you pull any kind of synthesis out of that? Daniel, in my opinion, and I think many people here's opinion, has a wonderfully organized systemic mind. I wanted to see what his knowledge system did to the field of psychotherapy, because I wanted to see to what extent are synced up. This has, of course, been a central question of mine, so I'd be happy to narrate that for you. The 8th word on the tree is mindfulness. What is that? How do I think about that? Is that always good? So if you know the field, you know there's some critics that talk about mindfulness. Isn't it just a bunch of cheap Western variants on that? Could be. but how do we know what that is? How do we think about that? These things are a little out, but I was trying to set this up, but I didn't quite have time. What's depression and how do you treat it? Actually, in terms of the applied domain, my expertise as a clinical psychologist, I decided to direct the focus of the unified theory on this question quite directly. I can share about that. What's your model of well-being? What is well-being? How do we talk about that? That'd be a good question. How do you understand relationships? Does that matter for the game B theorists? I listened to some game B theorists the other day, and then I got on the horn and talked to Jordan Hall, and I was like, just Jordan, there's a really key discrimination you need to make about the nature of human relationships and differentiating between power and influence and other key variables that I call like a relational value. And why is that important for the game B world? And then I mentioned at some flash through the garden and other poems that wisdom I think of as knowledge and practice toward valued states of being. Certainly that's a reasonable set of questions to ask about. And then that of course gives rise to the question about what are those values. I was then going to try to put this together into 6 different questions, and I got to 5, and I looked up and it was 1:59, and I decided that it'd probably be a good idea to stop that process and head on back to the Stoa and actually engage in the 2 o'clock event. So obviously these are just brainstorms. We can then see what other what questions these might spark in you, and of course anything else. So I am first and foremost, I'm a clinician. I've been doing psychotherapy for a really long time. And I'm happy to talk to you about what it's like to be a psychological doctor and how I view the world of mental health and therapy and anything else that's on people's minds.
All right, Greg, thanks. Mm-hmm. Maybe I could start with a question.
Sure.
Could you give us some context to ground, like you talked about how there's a meaning crisis and we're in this time between worlds. What is your interpretation of what it means to be a time between worlds? And then so we can better place why there is this need for these metapsych technologies and what the cause of these problems are.
Yeah. So this is a big question. A lot of people talk about this, and there's going to be a lot of different angles on it. So here's what I mean. I mean that we developed you can see systems of development that will reach sort of golden age functioning, and then they will outstrip the circumstances and evolutionary processes and whatever can outstrip their flexibility. I believe, in a nutshell, that modernity, the sensibility that we call modernity, got laid down, say, in the 16th to 17th century, all right, and then from the Renaissance into the Enlightenment. That gave rise to a particular it gave rise to modern empirical natural science. It gave rise to the modern philosophy, say Hume into Kant, and then certainly potentially into Hegel, but certainly modern philosophy can be really traced there. That's why modern is fun. It gives rise to political frameworks, liberal democracy. You see the French Revolution, the American Revolution. You see a shift from feudalism. You see Adam Smith and the emergence of capital. And you see the industrial capital labor system. And basically what you're going to then see is a sensibility, a technology, a political philosophy that comes out of Western Europe and colonizes the world. In fact, there was a famous historian talked about the end of identity and the end of history. He really meant the end of history is the end of a particular kind of identity. And the reason was because modernity had evolved in such a particular way that then came to dominate all the other traditionalist and oral indigenous sensibilities. Okay. So for a long time, there were just oral indigenous sensibilities. And then you get what's called the axial age. The axial age is the real birth and solidification. Really, it's a second wave of pre-modern but formal traditional systems of justification. They dominate the world for a while. And then you see the modernist revolution. Okay. So if we agree that modernity has this arc, my frame is that modernity is reaching the end of its capacity to be flexible, adaptive, and healthy. Okay. And so in other words, what it did is it spread out like a virus in a petri dish from the vantage point of the rest of the earth. We're the virus. Fun. Okay. I sometimes call us verbals. All right. It takes the edge off you. It's like, yeah, well, if you're another mammal, we're damn well look like verbals. Okay. So we spread out, right, in relationship. And now we basically occupy all the corners of the planet. And like a unbelievable paperclip machine, to use a metaphor that Daniel uses all the time, we used our capital labor structures and our technologies to extract all the resources out of planet Earth. Okay. And then translate them into the shit that surrounds me, which I love, by the way, woohoo. Okay. But of course it comes with the externalities, and the problem of that's a nightmare. All right. And so we're in the Anthropocene precisely because the way we populated the planet, the way we treat the planet, both has macro and micro level problems that are making it increasingly fragile. Okay. And the trajectory is not good. So if we continue with the way we're doing, that's the capital labor production consumption system is in deep trouble. Okay. So that's one big domain. We also create technologies that make us very powerful, and we don't have much in the way of wisdom. So we have CRISPR technologies and nukes and other kinds of issues that then, if it gets in the wrong hands, could then just unleash catastrophe and break the whole system. We're also interconnected in ways things like solar flares can blow us up unexpectedly. Okay. So we have a lot of we're highly stacked, massive vulnerabilities that are been emphasizing efficiency, but have not been emphasizing entrenched resilience and anti-fragility across the system. So that's one problem of modernity. Okay. Then you move over to the knowledge systems of modernity. Okay. The knowledge systems of modernity, meaning that science and philosophy, we're super damn good at the level of STEM, which means science and technology and engineering and math, natural science, engineering, math, understanding what physics were, chemistry, and biology, into neuroscience. And then the whole point is that shit hits the fan of comprehension, okay? And everything breaks down and nobody knows their ass from their elbow, really, okay? When you get into the matter-mind problem, and you basically see enough brilliance, but no coherence, and thus you get a fragmented, chaotic pluralism at the level of science, philosophy, and the humanities. Okay. And what it does to religion, the traditional formal systems, is it cuts the legs out from under that, but it doesn't turn around. It kills God, to use Nietzsche, but it doesn't turn around and give you a very clear sense of the human, okay, what its needs are, its fundamental place in nature and well-being, how to get along. And then that's going to create serious problems. It's a consequence of the problem of psychology. Okay. So now what you get basically is you get a fragmented knowledge system that gutted traditionalism, all right, that now is encountering the digital age. So as it encounters the digital age, you're now adding a technology that is completely changing all the rules of the game. As you also get critiques against the old system, the postmodern critique, which has a lot of validity, although it has no constructive statements to make at the level of, oh, this is what real knowledge is, but it tells you what it's not, and it tells you the limitations of modernity. So the consequence of all that unfolding is the meaning crisis, which is that we have no idea what's true and good anymore. Okay. So there's no way to yoke together what's true and good with a clear, coherent model of what does it mean to be human? What is a theory of psychology into the social sciences? Okay. And then we have all this power. We have all this chaos. We're through all these different changes. And you basically find yourself at the cusp of the edge of modernity, where the relationship we've built with the earth is tenuous, where the relationship with each other, given our power, is tenuous, and we're chaotically confused in a very, very dangerous way. Okay. So fundamentally, then, That's the idea. And then the tree of knowledge, right? The tree of knowledge tells you, well, where have we been? Well, the tree of knowledge allows you to extract from basic science and give you a map of big history with new resolution. It says, well, okay, you want to actually know what science says about where we've been with the level of epistemological and ontological authority that warrants the term science. Yeah, look at the tree of knowledge. Okay, that's really helpful because now we can consolidate pictures about where we've been. But in and of itself, it doesn't tell you really how to understand humanistically where we are, or even more importantly, where we ought to go in and of itself. Okay, I like to call it men's knowledge, okay, which is modernist empirical natural science. Helpful, but it also is dangerous of mansplaining everything, and it's not grounded in a contextual, and we need to move towards wisdom-oriented knowledge in the 21st century, aka woman's knowledge, okay, as a postmodern critique might suggest. So, indeed, my whole journey from the tree of knowledge into the theory of knowledge tree in the garden is the transformation from a natural science coherence into a scientific humanistic wisdom orientation. Okay. And then I've got lots of threads to fill in with that. But what the basic task is, I would argue, is an awakening of consciousness outside of the modernist ways of thinking into a meta-modern sensibility, that allows us to appreciate the various sensibilities across cultural time. That, by the way, is the oral indigenous sensibility, which we need to remember and realize that that's true in all of our family relations. We need to embrace the wisdom of the ancient traditions and understand how to we need to understand the truth of modern science and the proper critique of a postmodern perspective and the fact that it was tangled with social categories like whiteness and maleness, right? And do all of that to then create a meta-modern sensibility that says, oh, we can develop a scientific, humanistic, wise way of being in the world that appreciates where people are, how they interact, and then starts the process of transforming chaotic and very, very scary, polarized, oh my God, defensive, regressive, into a much more centered, clear, mindful, global, national, community, family, individual place. Okay. And if we do that, that's a sustainable wisdom of the back half of the 21st century that actually is like, oh, okay, we might be able to actually have a proper relationship with each other and the planet if we do that.
That seems like you haven't really thought about this much, Greg. So I have lots of follow-ups.
That's a real curveball, Anjan. I was like, I got to go back and see if I can study my notes on that one.
Well, to tag it into metapsych technologies, then it seems that the massive industry of self-help and productivity and mindfulness and even mech mindfulness and so on has risen up in response to these set of problems. With the TOK in mind, could you give us a sense of like why they're not very effective? Yeah.
Sure. So the short answer is what what you're witnessing on the receiving end, okay, is people that are able to capture your attention, okay? And the way they're able to capture your attention generally, although I think this is changing now, but the way they capture your attention and say, hey, we have a solution for you. Okay. And then they'll show some anecdote of some person that, hey, when this hit me, all of a sudden I went from B, which sucked, into A, which is great. And this must be the solution. Okay. And then you have right marketing and you do all that. And undoubtedly there will be a line of wisdom in there. Okay. But one thing I will tell all of you very clearly is that mental health issues are complex, adaptive, dynamic issues. I'll say that again. They're complex, adaptive, dynamic issues. Okay. If you were here prior to me at this exact time, you had Dave Snowden here. Okay. And the Seinfeld frame and others. And the big difference between a complicated frame, okay, that a complicated can be really intense, but it has an algorithm to it. Okay. A complex adaptive means that as you start with the algorithm, all of a sudden the autopilot system will have an absolute reaction to it. Okay. Why is that really important? Well, many of the things you're being sold out there in self-help is just do this, follow this set of recipes. All right. Well, basically, you can almost be guaranteed that a set of recipes in a simplistic way, or just even a complicated way, is not going to be up to task. Okay. So another problem is that the filtering system, actually, we see this in medicine and nutrition all the time. The filtering system is not framed well. Okay. You are not given through your education a coherent sense-making system to take the pieces of information and then put it in a dynamic picture that allows it to be placed for whatever slice of information it has. Now, I have that because I built one. So I can now extract, oh, here's the slice of information, and now put it into a frame of mind. An average guy going through, it's just sort of like, okay, here is this. Now, how is that going to hit with whatever else is in his head, whoever else he's around, whatever way of being in the world? And so I often like to say that what people are showing you are kind of cool sandcastles of understanding. Like they'll build an empirical paradigm and they'll find some findings. And if it's an applied thing, they can say, hey, and even powerful things like growth mindset, they'll say, hey, this really is like, yeah, but how does that sit in a system when it starts to become conscious of all of this? Okay, and I'll put it. So if everybody now knows about growth mindset, does it work the same? Okay, you can see this in terms of things like ADHD. Kenneth Connor, all right, was a powerful neuropsychologist in the 1970s. And he did rightfully identify a subset of kids who likely had not just neuroatypical, but fundamental neurodeficiency in the development of the prefrontal frontal lobe. Okay. And that without that nice structure, they were so impaired in their impulsivity and their fractured way of thinking that they really needed to be given a very serious set of help. And they were called ADHD kids. Okay. But what happened, to Keith Connor's horror, is that people then could see that they could take stimulant medications and other behavioral programs and labeling and find the hyperactive kids who love to play in recess, mostly boys, and label them as a problem, drug them, and then put them on behavioral plans to get them to conform. Okay. So that now we get about 10 to 15% in some cases are being identified as ADHD. Okay. What a disaster. Unbelievable. All right. Now, so what you need to understand with psychology as to why it's so complicated is A, it's complex adaptive, and B, there's an iterative process by the claims you make and what people become and policies and everything else. So it's a shit show of complexity. You're going to drop a shit show of complexity into a system that the people who are the experts don't even understand. Like I'm telling you, no one knows what psychology is. Well, you flood the system and you get an enormous amount of chaos. And that's, so what people are trying to do is they're learning stuff. There's gold out there. But when you look at the overall, what you see, is an enormous amount of chaos and a very, very bad lacking in principled coordination. And what the things that the tree of knowledge fundamentally is about is, get your concepts and categories right, get the dynamic interrelationship between those right, and work from the right map.
Andy had a question in this regard.
Greg, I am curious how your TOK framework builds on Maslow in the sense that at the time and for a couple decades, maybe the way to be wise and to have well-being was to self-actualize. Mm-hmm. And you're incorporating the interpersonal as a level beyond that. So how do we actualize interpersonally? And how does that fit into the TOK framework in terms of optimizing well-being and wisdom?
Brilliant. Yeah. Okay. Lots to say here. So let's just help people make sure that they're oriented. So Abraham Maslow, one of the two great humanistic psychologists, the other being Carl Rogers. There were certainly others, but if you have to pick two humanistic psychologists, Carl Rogers was central in therapy, and Abraham Maslow more in personality, motivation, and what would become the precursor of positive psychology. Probably the most famous thing that Maslow is known for is his hierarchy of needs. Okay. And Maslow argued that there were essentially a developmental need progression that as you met these needs, you would see people grow. And he argued, as all the humanists do, is that if you give people the right environment, they grow in the positive direction. Okay, so that there is an organismic valuing process. And Maslow argued that first you got to take care of physiological needs, for instance. All right, so take care of air, take care of food, take care of water, create then safety related needs, okay, in relationship to get territory. If you're getting your ass beaten every day, that's going to be a high priority. If it's war, be aware of that. Okay. Then he jumps up into two very important levels, okay, which are the psychosocial levels of sort of our everyday primate person world, one of which is belonging. Okay. And in the unified theory, there's a thing called the influence matrix, which I'm happy to elaborate on. But basically it says, hey, here is a map of the core of your relationship system. And by the core, I mean your relationship system as a primate. So the vast majority of this architecture is laid down before we start talking. This is the kind of stuff that guided us as hunter-gatherers in a pre-linguistic world, and we can see very clearly in the rest of the primate kingdom. Okay. It argues that the core, the backbone of that relationship system, is a thing called the social influence and relational value line, or RVSI, relational value, social influence. And it says that what we are tracking in the matrix of our world is to the extent to which we're known and valued and have social influence, we can move other people in accordance with our influence. Okay. And that basically is an updated version of what Maslow called belonging. Okay? In fact, Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary wrote a great articulation of belonging in 1995. And Mark Leary actually is the source of why I use the term relational value. Excellent psychologist. So belonging then, and this actually gets to the game B question. One of the things that I want to emphasize is that we have motives both for social influence and relational value. All right. And actually relational value is the extent to which you're known and valued by other people. Social influence is the extent to which you can instrumentally move other people in accordance with your desires. Okay. The capitalist industry system generally emphasizes social influence. Okay. Get high status, get a high paying job, get money, and therefore you can instrumentally move people around. All right. Our current president, we'll see how much longer, our current president is an exemplar of high social influence emphasis relative to relational value. Okay. Relational value means the extent to which you feel known and valued by other people. And that's a big difference. We care about both. Okay. We want a society that moves towards maximizing relational value. And actually, I think we need to shift away from social influence. I can get into that detail. Okay. Maslow argued that once we were actually able to meet our belonging needs, once we were in adolescence, we then had a secondary relational need that was more our self. He called it self-esteem. This refers to the extent to which your identity really is kind of then separate from your core feeling. Like in childhood, you don't feel all that much. But once you get an identity, then the question self-esteem is the extent to which do you know and value yourself? Okay. And Maslow noted that people that had good belonging and then had known and valued themselves, all right, had high self-esteem in an authentic way, right, was unbelievably key. And you may have, if you're up in the 1980s, you may remember that all of a sudden everyone became self-esteem nation. It was like, oh my God, it's self-esteem. That's the most important variable in mental health. And then everybody in California started doing, oh, we have to raise everybody's self-esteem because this is the root of all mental health. Okay. So don't criticize people and give everybody a cupcake, which is actually the worst thing you can effing do for self-esteem. Okay. But people manipulated, they just didn't understand. So that's an aside. But from an authentic Maslowian perspective, then what you have is the integrity of the identity that then loves oneself or has respect, really, and compassion for oneself. Then what he gets into is then the higher forms of ego functioning. All right. And this is definitely something that we want to cultivate. The higher forms of ego functioning get into when you realize when you shift, okay, from an egoic perspective. An egoic perspective is I care about my status and my family and what I get and whether I get money, right? You know, if I invented the unified theory, everybody give me credit. All right. So, and then you become actualized. All right. To become actualized is to realize, very much like in many of the wisdom traditions, is to become whole and not become sort of that ego defensive shell, basically. And by become whole, it's just an acceptance of where it is that your potential is, and a fundamental then seeking of growth without necessarily fear and protection of the esteem and belonging needs, because you get enough of them met. Right? And then he ultimately argued, in fact, Kaufman just produced a book, it's over there on my shelf, about the highest level of transcendence. And this is, you can really then see this in the wisdom perspectives. Once you become actualized as a full human being, you start to transcend the ego, as I mentioned. A full state of enlightened transcendence is really then when you basically identify with all other humanity, with sentient beings. The Confucians have a model of the expansion of self to become we-ness of all creatures, that self-transcendent being. So I think Maslow has a very, very powerful model. Of course, the humanists were at war with the cognitivists, the behaviorists, the psychodynamic people inside of psychology. There wasn't a whole lot of way to have a meta-psychology that could harmonize them. Much of my argument is that with the right frame of reference, you can have sort of a psychology Rosetta Stone, and you can see very clearly what people were trying to say, and then pull the best of the best, put them together to create, from the noise, create music and have more harmony. And yes, I think that a movement towards actualization, Maslow was brilliant in that regard. And those are things that I absolutely endorse.
Andy, did you have a follow-up?
So how might we persuade the culture to value or prioritize relational value over social influence as a vehicle to helping them understand well-being and wisdom?
Good. That's a great question. The first thing we need to do is we need to educate people about it. Okay. So I know that, but that's part of what the unified theory affords me. You could talk to 94 psychologists. I mean, it's a concept that's really embedded. It arises out of the tree of knowledge frame of unifying psychology. It's certainly extracted from others. Mark Leary, I mentioned other people. I mean, this is like so much of the theory, it assimilates and integrates. Okay. But the argument is that we need assimilation integration for consolidation to then send the proper message out to people. This is what I'm so critical. Why I feel the theory is so important is that it consolidates, assimilates, integrates, and then allows us to translate the message in the right way with the core principles delivered to the people. And that's what we haven't done, okay? But to understand it, just pay attention. I mean, okay, so me as a clinician, you can decide whether this, here are some of the pictures that I see, all right? So I see low relational value, low social influence. What does that look like? Well, people come in and they say, nobody cares about me. I was rejected in elementary school. I was abused by my family. You know, I tried to succeed in school. I wasn't very bright. I didn't know what I was doing. You know, I work as a part-time laborer in an impoverished area, and I'm a drunk. Okay, well, you know, and then we'll diagnose you with being depressed as some mental disorder. You know, when I'm like, fuck, if I had to switch with you, man, I'd be goddamn depressed. I'll tell you that. Right. Okay. And the issue is that person, unfortunately, his resources, his coping, his chain of social influence pushed him into a system where he has so little experience of who cares about him, nobody, very little money. He looks on the world, sees everybody else has what he doesn't have, and he feels completely miserable. So that's low relational value, low social influence. Okay. I see that all the time, and that's super straightforward. Here's another interesting thing. I've seen individuals come in that are like super successful. Okay. They achieved in school, they got the job that they wanted, they come to me, they're like, Greg, my life's empty. There's no fucking point. Okay. I did all this stuff, but you know, I thought if I did all this stuff, everyone told me that everything would be fine. I did it. And I was like, well, who, you know, basically you get in there, person's been an imposter their whole life. Okay. They thought that as long as they put on the social expectations of what was judged to be valuable and they followed that, they then got the influence from other people, but all the while their own heart, their own true valuing system is like, I don't really give a shit about this, but people tell me and they will like me if I fill these roles. So these individuals have done social influence, but they've sacrificed their true relational value because they're valued for their fake self. And that's a real trouble. Okay. And if you're valued for your fake self, then you have this huge dilemma where you're like, well, I get reinforced because other people like me for being my fake self. But every night I go to bed, I have to live with the felt experience that if they really knew me, they would likely reject me. And then that weighs horribly on the psyche's soul. Okay. And I ask anybody, just talk to people. You'll see lots of people live with the imposter syndrome. All right. And now I'll tell you, people who I've been pretty fortunate in my life. I know what my core essence is, and I have found a path at least to get enough relational value and social influence for my core essence. The unified theory is my essence. My wife loves me for my unified theory. I got hired for my unified theory. I can share that. Okay. And you find me people whose their true essence that gets expressed for which they're known and valued. And I'll show you people whose mental health generally is pretty damn good, unless they got something else going on. There are other things that can go wrong. But in terms of the core alignment of psychosocial functioning, that's the essence. So you align the true seeking with being valued in high social influence, and boom, you have the foundation of good socio-emotional functioning. We should teach people that, okay? And realize that if you manipulate them into instrumental control, okay, you create toxicity everywhere, and you're going to demonstrate an enormous amount of emptiness, imposter syndrome, manipulation, defensiveness, and a deep, empty, alienating experience of being, which I would say is less than ideal.
Greg, there's a question from the chat. Like narcissism, can that be one thing that goes wrong?
Well, narcissism gives, okay, so what people will then do with narcissism generally, so in order to achieve social influence and be known and valued, you're seeking 3 different process dimensions, okay? One of which is, I could pull up the influence matrix if that'd be helpful, but basically it tracks it on 3 different dimensions. One's called the power dimension, one's called the love dimension, and one's called the freedom dimension. Okay. What you want is the complex adaptive balance between those capacities to give rise to a felt sense of being known and valued. Okay. What sometimes happens, this was identified by Karen Horney, is that as people experience attachment anxiety, another way of saying that is their relational value anxiety, they develop certain types of compensatory mechanisms to maintain defensive equilibrium. Wright talks about character armor. Okay. And what people will then do is they'll put lots of emphasis on particular strategies. All right. So what is narcissism? Well, narcissism then is a developed emphasis on the power strategy. And as I tell all my students, I don't care what your political affiliation is. One thing about Trump is he's wonderfully educational at the level of narcissism, not narcissistic personality disorder. That's another interesting question. We can debate about that. But in terms of a narcissistic archetypal structure, that's exactly what that is. Okay. And what do I mean by that? He positions himself in a win-loss competitive position. If you love him for his wins, he loves you back. Okay. If you challenge him and debate whether or not he's won fairly or done the right thing, he attacks you and tries to degrade you and demonstrate that you're inferior. That's it. He's just an algorithm. He's like a robot. All you need to do is put the data in and you will see he'll instantaneously engage in that. Okay. That's just what he does. And so what that is that's an archetypal narcissistic algorithm processor. That's just what it is. So, we can debate whether that's a disorder. He's the damn president of the United States. So at a social influence level, he was a hell of a lot more successful than me in getting social influence.
There was another question in that regard. So it's so everyone learns TOK and our problems are solved.
Yeah, just fly off into utopia. I don't think we have to worry about a utopia here. The argument fundamentally is that, well, I mean, we are seeing all of these sense-making communities emerge because the so-called blue church is so inadequate, okay? I'm searching for something adequate. I ain't thinking for something perfect. It's inadequate right now, our sense-making systems. They could be upgraded tremendously. If they upgrade tremendously, we can then actually start to tackle the problems in a much more efficient way. I mean, we have serious effing problems. The question for me is whether or not we hit the iceberg and sink this thing, which is probably close to probable, okay? Or we actually avert that, bump into the iceberg, and yeah, if we were actually harmonized with the right particular knowledge systems, our potentials for moving up Maslow's hierarchy is a hell of a lot better than we're doing now. That's for sure. So I'm not big in relationship to, utopia. I mean, I'm a clinician, for the love of God. The dark side of the soul and the potential that people have for narcissistic defensiveness and the traumas of their history and the state of affairs that our planet is in. But yeah, certainly my argument is, oh my God, if people knew that when you said science, we didn't just say what the media interpreted some latest speculative scientist as saying, but actually is like, oh, like you mean the Big Bang, quantum mechanics, general relativity, natural selection, cell theory. Yeah. Okay. Now organized into a system of understanding. Yeah. If we actually walked around with that knowledge, I think we would be in a lot better. And that's the analytic side of it. There's also the values side of it. And, but that's certainly my pitch.
Peter Sforza had a question, and then Dave afterwards.
Okay, thanks, Anjan. Hi, Greg. Good to see
Hey, Peter. Good to see you, friend.
So I'm curious about you're referring to maybe this Rosetta Stone analogy, and another system I've been thinking a lot about is maybe the Tower of Babel.
Yep.
And when we build these kind of unified systems, it's one of the concerns I have. In fact, I've stopped building unified systems to study why they fail.
Yep.
And on that note, it's like, yeah, maybe wisdom is the ability to not talk about wisdom. Or as Dave Snowden said to me the other week when I was kind of pitching wisdom architectures, he said, he kind of laughed, said, yeah, kind of data, information, knowledge, wisdom, and the next thing that should come is eschatology, but the end. And so that's, he's got a pretty dry wit, but so I'm just curious about, how do we know you're building the Rosetta Stone that assimilates and integrates all these things? And is that really what we want to translate to people? What if the systems that you're integrating are flawed themselves at the foundational level, and we end up building sort of this Tower of Babel that maybe is dangerous and powerful, yes, but dangerous. And
sure.
has problems. So maybe you can respond to that.
Yeah, there was a glitch there. I heard you say Dave Snowden and then data, information, knowledge, wisdom, and then there was a glitch.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay. So Dave, his next part to that would be DIKW, and then eschatology should come after it. Like the end. Yeah, it's a joke, but yeah. No, it's a serious kind of dry humor that Dave had. So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, listen, here's where I am. I'd certainly locate myself as a meta-modern sensibility. Okay. And what I mean by that is absolutely, I'm anchored to an integrated pluralism. There's a lot of brilliant stuff going on over there around. There's a lot of chaotic stuff. So fantastic. So here, so I'm offering a particular frame of reference, and then people can decide how it's useful or not. I certainly don't offer it in any kind of authoritarian power sort of way. I'm not here at any level asking people to bow down to this thing or saying we should institutionalize it in any kind of way. That let that unfold in a particular way. I'm here to say, and what I was emphasizing, in the last session that I had at the problem of psychology is that, yeah, I can tell you, I would argue, with the same degree of clarity that quantum mechanics and general relativity spoke to and I revealed the inadequacies of Newtonian mechanics. I'm here to tell you that empirical psychology sucks at the level of its capacity to cohere. And I can tell you why. Okay. I can tell you the ontological and epistemological errors that it made. And I can tell you how to build a better mousetrap. And I can tell you when to do that. All of a sudden, a lot of the key insights align. But I'm not God. It's like maybe I'm wrong, and then nobody needs to pay any attention. That's fine. So, and for me, all I'm saying is that actually my experience is indeed not. I want to be clear about the sequence here. The sequence is not, oh my God, I'm going to build a unified theory because I don't like the fragmentation. We must do it. So now I did this. And now to confirm my ego that I did it, I now have everybody instituting this paradigm. So this is not built to solve the Tower of Babel. Okay. I fell into the problem, and out of the process of building the solution to the problem that I had for myself, I then backed up and was like, hey, this damn thing works like a Rosetta Stone. And then you're like, oh, if you actually know the errors that are embedded in modernity that you can simply correct, well, then that's better. Okay. Now, to then say, well, okay, now, if that's true, now you have a unified theory, so therefore now you have authority. Fuck that. No. Okay. I'm anti-authoritarian. And I love the meta-modern sensibility that basically says, yeah, well, there's going to be an integrated pluralism. I've looked out itself. I listened to Daniel Schmachtenberg. He knows all sorts of stuff I don't know. Okay. He's got all sorts of different frames. Many people do. I'm hanging out with Alexander Bard. He's a Zoroastrian Eastern thinker. Okay. Totally. Although it's a miracle though, how much our systems line up. So there's no one system. Okay. I'm a pragmatist in many ways. If it solves problems, great. If I can see exactly where Skinner was right and where he was wrong, if I can see where Freud was right and where he was wrong, if I see where Beck was right and where he was wrong, and I see where Rogers was right and where he was wrong, and then I can pull that together and say, actually, here's how you line up habits and emotions and relationships, defenses and identity, and hand that to you. And then if it works, great. So that's the bottom line, is that this is, I'm definitely not, any authority on high should be strongly resisted if you're following my system, at least in its spirit, because it hates that crap. Okay. But it just asks, to what extent does it work and put stuff together? And I do argue that it puts stuff together in a pretty intense and deep way, just like good knowledge should.
Do you have a follow-up, Peter?
No, thanks. Thanks, Greg.
Great question. Thank you. It is a central question attitudinally. And in fact, I've centered on this a lot. This is why I love the meta-modern sensibility. Both modernists and postmodernists hate the unified idea. They both do. Okay. So in other words, the modernity tried to develop a unified system, and then it broke and failed. And postmodernity comes along and says it would be ridiculous to even try. Okay. So for a long time, although people have hunted for this, the current sensibility is you shouldn't do it. My argument is, yeah, let it be very wary about any authoritarian unified system. That's for damn sure. But there's integrated pluralistic sensibilities, and we can correct past errors, and we can make better sense making. That's for sure.
Okay. David Jacobs.
Greg, I loved what I just heard. Integrating and unifying. And so I've been kind of dabbling in different aspects of, so might call it psychology. I did have a couple of different therapists for a while, vastly different in their skill level. And several prime questions have always rattled around in my mind, because I not only did work with a therapist, and one was a psychoanalyst, The other one was that I did personal growth work in several different modalities. One of them 12-step programs.
Okay.
And I found that that I came to the conclusion I could not have made the growth and progress without being in the 12-step programs, even though the 12-step programs had lots of deficiencies as far as I was concerned.
Sure.
So what I'm wondering is, if you're in agreement that for your clients or for any individual that's trying to find self-actualization, I'm clear that you probably understand a lot of their barriers, a lot of the things that are going to hold them back. But it's real important, I believe, and the way I did it was to find my own blocks and just keep showing up, even though I didn't want to, because even that resistance was another block. You know, it's just another thing to jump over. So I'm kind of curious if you see the value and what systems of personal growth, which don't cost a huge amount of money, because I know a psychoanalyst and a therapist is way beyond most people.
Yeah, no doubt.
What do you see as the best recipe for not only sort of overcoming your addictions and your dysfunctional behavior, but then moving off into self-actualization and spirituality and connectedness with the whole world and not being confused anymore?
Brilliant. Okay. It's a great question. It's a big question. So one of the first things I'll say is sort of what I said before. These types of questions depend so much on the individual, what's happened to them. Are we talking, what kind of trauma? What's their current situation? What resources do they have? What are their values? What's their stage of change? I mean, it's precisely because it's a complex, a dynamic element that to then say, oh, this is the path, is to be like, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So very rare. It's not a simple answer where one size fits all. We'll put it that way. Okay. Yeah. But that said, that's not to say that you can't say anything intelligent about it. Okay. So depression's a really complicated answer. I'll go with that one. A complicated set of issues. You actually can frame depression really easily, I argue. Depression should be understood as a state of behavioral shutdown. Okay? That should describe what we mean. And then more in rich detail, it's really a state of psychic energy shutdown, all right, where your emotional and motivational system, which has this two different charges of positive affect and negative affect, goes into a phase shift where you pull the positive affect down and jack the negative affects up. Why do you do that? Because your path of behavioral investment has been constrained, injured, you can't move in a particular way. So the system adopts a defensive shutdown process. Now, why does it do that? Well, you might have reacted to something. If your heart was just broken, if you just lost a child, if you live under a homeless person, live under a bridge, some of the people I've worked with, a lot of good reasons to be shut down potentially in what I call a depressive reaction. Okay? At the same time, if you shut down, okay, and you don't understand what's happening to your emotion, and you hate the fact that you shut down, and other people blame you for feeling sorry for yourself, your head will turn against your heart and you'll break it off, and your heart will rebel, and you get in what's called a depressive disorder. That is a fight between your head and your heart, where you have negative reactions to the negative feelings you have to ensue a depressive maladaptive cycle. We see a lot of that. Okay, you get stuck. Some people, for a whole host of vulnerable reasons, obviously all of that those affect systems run on neurobiological structures, and you can get those things knocked out in certain ways. Those are depressive diseases. Right? All of that's possible, but we don't have the right language. I did a 15-part blog series, okay, for free, precisely because I know so many people do not have access, that created a self-help walkthrough about how you understand what to do when you're depressed. And I put it up on Psychology Today. Okay. It might be of interest to note that the first 7, okay, are basically awareness and acceptance elements. Okay. awareness and acceptance. In other words, people are like, oh, here's what you do. And actually the first thing you do is realize, what is depression and why am I depressed? And how can I start to accept the fact that that is, and it sucks. Okay. Rather than, oh my God, this is what I need to do to get out of it. All right. Now you, David, said something really important. I learned through the process that I needed to keep showing up. All right. That means you had fortitude and will, and that's a virtue when you're trying to overcome this. All right. Okay, a lot of people don't, they run. But actually, if you learn to actually approach and lean in and stick with it, and you get some good coaching, you can figure out how to accept and habituate to a lot of the shit you didn't know how to look at. All right. And that allows you to wake up to the traumas and the shadows that sit at the dark side of our psyche. All right. It also then allows you to be in access to possible skills of doing something different. Okay. So the attitude that you just described is very important as part of the motivational structure of people who are able to climb out. Okay. Versus individuals who don't. I work a lot. There's a whole class of therapies called motivational interviewing. And they're about trying to tap into exactly what you said and cultivate the attitude that says, oh God, I may climb up a hill and then fall back down into a valley, because very rarely is it a linear line toward health. In fact, if it is, I'm going to be scratching my head going, that person really learned what they needed to learn, right? You know? I mean, if you don't fall down and cut your emotional knee on several different sharp rocks, then I don't know that you're really anti-fragile in that way. Okay. So you got to regress. You got to understand what that dark night of the soul is. All right. You have to know how to be there and be present, so you don't go knee jerking, escaping and thinking, I can't handle this. And why have I failed again? Right. You got to be able to manage that. So there's a lot of cultivation of proper attitude, cultivation of relationship of head and heart, finding people who actually can hold you in proper attachment relations based on what your traumas were, understanding if you're doing addiction, understanding what the parasite of mind that pulls you into those cravings are all about, right? And how they try to escape, what is that? Wilbur talked about the appetitive and aversive aspects of the shadow. The appetitive is, oh my God, I need this. And the aversive, I never want to see this. Okay. So we're on this energy system behind which we don't often understand. So the path towards growth is figuring out how to peer behind those, wake up to your shadow, look behind, understand how that ego system engages in defenses, go through some serious shit, hopefully with yourself and other people who love you, figure out how to re-narrate that story, teach skills that actually have healthy lifestyles and allow for good emotional functioning, learn the transfer and shit you do in your relationships, cultivate a valued state of being. And if you find good, effective efficacy in doing that, then you start to embody that. And you'll start to climb out, no doubt.
Dave, do you have a follow-up?
When I'm listening to Greg, I need to digest what I just heard, because he'll just keep going and I'll just keep soaking it up. So let somebody else ask a question and it'll take it in another direction.
Thank you, David. That's a great question.
We have a question from Robert, and after that, I'm going to call on Ron.
All right, great. Can you guys hear me?
I can. Hi, Ron.
Oh, thank you so much for this and your content with John. First of all, it's just fantastic. And so I'm overeducated, so I have a lot of familiarity with a lot of what you're saying, and I love the way you as you said, unify everything. So I had kind of a different question about triviality, and I feel like as someone in 2020, I can now just ignore reality almost and just be intellectually engaged, romantically engaged. It's all bullshit. I can be in this veneer of bullshit pretty much perpetually. So do you have any thoughts about that, or do you notice that in the world, or is I don't know, does that make sense even?
No, of course it makes sense. Okay. So yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different, there's the epistemological problem of bullshit and whether we're just participating in a particular way. Okay. So, and what I mean by that is, how am I going to frame, my participation? Is person X bullshitting? There's that question. And then there's the opportunity for living in a virtual world of bullshit and any other number of places. Okay. And this, by the way, is, I think that to find, if you're going to live in the film of bullshit, generally speaking, now this isn't true of everybody because there's a lot of different constitutions out there, but generally speaking, you're going to be vulnerable to a part of your heart, okay, that is seeking potential. I'm a humanist in this regard. And what that's going to then tell you is it's going to nag at you and make you feel empty. All right. So then the question is, do you listen to that? And then how do you listen to that? I'll bring Zach Stein back into this, okay, and say that part of what I believe the human developmental seeking can be nicely divided into, especially it's pragmatically divided into, is capacities and skill development. Let's say, you're an unbelievable chess player as a potential and you love playing that. Well, that's going to pull you into some particular way, okay? Then there's ensoulment. That gets into the core experience of who you are behind the shit of your shadow. That's the depth psychology. Into the core of known and valued. How much are you bullshitting? What potentials do you have with peers and friends, your extended family, potential lovers, okay? And what is it seeking in relationship to that known and valued fulfillment across those domains and your adult identity back in you, okay? So that relationship is the ensoulment relationship for me. And if you're living in a life of bullshit, a big part of that's going to feel shallow and empty, all right? And then the question is, are you willing to ask hard questions about that, okay? And then finally, the other part that I think will also feel empty is that transcendent part, all right? The transcendent part is the whole issue of, do you matter to the to the generations that come after you? Okay. Are you being a good ancestor? What is the ultimate concern at a secular immortality central, at an ultimate concern of what Aristotle talked about, or you go theologically and think about, if you have a personal relationship with God or the idea of the concept of God shining back, and then it's like, what matters fundamentally? And obviously, if you're living a life of bullshit, almost by definition, you're saying, I'm not going to worry about that. Okay. So the argument would be then that at the level of ensoulment and at the level of transcendence, that you're going to be a bit on the empty side, if that's what you just are puttering around in. And if you want to live your best life, well, then maybe you want to reflect on that.
So then maybe a follow-up would be like, if you feel like you have a pretty healthy life and you're got a good social network and a good job, and maybe you're meditating or you're spiritual or whatever, then what amount of distraction or art, if you want to reframe it into something that's more culture, like what should someone be doing in the modern world besides working and personally growing maybe?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a, right. So now if we say, actually, all right, there are a couple of different layers of the bullshit question, and maybe I didn't track you exactly. So let me see if I can now track you. There's what I would call now that the real complex question of like the meta into personal dimension of bullshit versus substance. Okay. Like what ought to we be doing with our lives? All right. If you are feeling personally fulfilled across what I've just talked about, that's one issue, but it should have, the transcendence will bring this in, by the way, it should have a nagging question of, am I doing what's right? Okay. Am I cultivating virtue? Now, what the answer to that I think is super complicated. Okay. Fundamentally complicated, because there's so much uncertainty about, well, what ought to we be doing? All right. And I struggle with this myself. I certainly don't live as virtuous a life as the transcendent part of me. I actually, in sitting in Daniel's thing, I'm a turkitarian. So I gave up 4 years ago. I gave up pork and beef and any red meat and all this, but I still eat chickens and turkey. And with, I don't know, at least we try to buy non-factory farm stuff, but fairly regularly. My wife and I will bring home factory farm crap. So I sat in Daniel, if you were there for Daniel's, he gave a good half an hour articulation of him being a vegetarian, right? And I walked in and I got all pissed in the kitchen, and my wife and I had a little tiff about it because I'm like, fuck, I'm immoral because I'm going to have chicken. And it's true. And then my wife, who's had a long, exhausting day, she gets dragged in. It's like, leave me that. I don't want to get contaminated by this. I just bought chicken. What the fuck? It's like, so there you go. So now it's like, well, is the proper thing for me to do to now, get rid of all of this and say for Thanksgiving, no, I'm not going to eat chicken. I mean, And definitely there's a moral part of me that says, yes, absolutely. And I feel the guilt of that. And I'm confessing my sins here to you all, and I'm far from perfect. Okay. And at the same time, good Christ, if I were really to go off, I mean, I listen to like Daniel Thorson and everything. Should I just pack up my shit and head up to, some monastery in the middle of Vermont? I mean, is that the proper way of living? Not necessarily for me. Right. So in some ways I'm now participating in this sick Titanic system. How do you participate in it? How do you change it? How do you make sure you're maximizing the leverage for what is good? I think those are, and not just living a life of bullshit that's actually participating in its ultimate downfall. How do you note and decipher those things at a level of abstraction, given all the uncertainties and unprestatable futures that we are looking at? That's an ongoing question. And even last Monday, I had my own little crisis with whether or not I was appropriately living up to what my transcendent self was suggesting. So I think welcome to the struggle is really, when you really get into the sophisticated nature of that question, is welcome to the struggle.
Yeah, that was great. And I just appreciate how you both were so high level and also insightful and honest about how you grapple with these things, and even like the constraints of reality as they unfold in front of you. So thank you.
Sure.
Ron has a question, and then Billy would be after.
Ron, I can't hear you. You're not muted, but we can't hear you.
I think I'm going to read out his question.
Okay.
I'm wondering how Jungian individuation ensoulment kind of perspective fits in with Gregg's model, and what he thinks of that as a therapeutic modality.
Okay, so right, I'm not a Jungian. I'm in the sense that I certainly have a number of Jungian friends. I'm not certainly. That's a very reasonable and important depth psychology perspective. Okay, and by depth psychology perspective, I think with so many different things that we're talking about, what is the fundamental energies, archetypes, frames that reside on the backside, the dark side of our consciousness, dark side of the moon, dark side of our consciousness. And there are lots of different ways to shine the flashlight into that area and to gain touch with that. And I think Jung's analyses are as rich. They're also super freaking complicated in like so many different areas. I really, early on, I was like, I just can't read this guy. I tried to read Jung and I don't know what the hell he's talking about. It's just everything's layered on top of everything else. And of course, a lot of people experience me that way. But, anyway, when I was doing Jung, I was like, Jesus, I come back to him and I have a deep appreciation. I actually, some of that was revived by Jordan Peterson's appreciation for Jung. And I have a mixed and generally positive connection to Jordan Peterson and his arc across the cultural consciousness. So if you have the time and the energy and the luxury to do depth work, great. I certainly think that I appreciate the culture. I like to see that it's coming back. I love anima archetypal thinking. I love Jung's capacity as sort of a psychiatric anthropologist, depth guy, to see cultural traditions and to explore that. I really deeply appreciate his journey. And I think a lot of Jungian analysts have some really interesting things to say. Now, I'm a psychological doctor, okay? And I don't think that people as psychological doctors employed by, let's say, health service institutions that are fed by and framed by government and insurance should just be analysts, psychoanalytic or Jungian analytic individuals in and of themselves, because of that frame is really a luxury. As a psychotherapist, what you get is our task is not to peer into the crevices of every psyche and help people realize the underlying depth of their soul. I don't think that that's a luxury that should be part of the general health service frame. The issue is people are having neurotic maladaptive patterns, okay? And we need to maximize in time-sensitive ways. We need to understand what those entrenched maladaptive patterns are. This is the fundamental work of a psychological doctor. Diagnose those so that you create a shared understanding, pretty concrete, create a good interpersonal healing relational process, develop a shared understanding of its history, the person, the situation, and their resources. Develop a treatment plan, and then move the person efficiently, tracking outcomes, so that you have an active intervention of 16 to 20 sessions for most individuals. Certainly, if people have serious functional problems, you continue with maintenance, okay? But a long-term depth work kind of dynamic really has to be done in a culture, by a wealthy person, in a context, one's own exploration into that. So those are just some of the thoughts about sort of the Jungian frame and Jungian work at a therapeutic level.
Lee, did you have your question?
Huh?
Did you want to ask your question?
Me?
Mhm.
Yeah. So what what does your model say about things like personality typologies, like people trying to come up with identities or ways of classifying what kind of modality of psychology people fit into in a way that's like more like I guess from birth or maybe from childhood, their tendencies. Maybe some people are inherently more prone to value certain things than others, or
Sure. Okay, so there would be, you and I would maybe benefit a little bit from some language discussion to get clear, but I'll give you some thoughts. Personality is one of my areas of expertise. So as is so many cases, when you get in the expertise, there are a lot of, well, what do you mean this by this? So let me give you some thoughts. And then, so one of the big debates in the history of the field is the categories and types versus dimensions. Okay. So categories and types are the ideas, oh, you're a narcissist, or, oh, you're an avoidant personality, or, oh, you're a histrionic. Those are different categories. The Myers-Types Briggs tries to create categories of people. You do a 4x4 grid, and then you say, oh, I'm an INTJ. And then they argue that that's a type. Okay, that's one way of thinking about personalities. Empirically, generally, meaning that when you take a scientific analysis of the way in which variation moves across groups, a much, much more powerful model is a dimensional model. Okay. A dimensional model says it's not so much there, and this is where it gets complicated. There are good type models, but the vast majority of like personality concepts that are valid from a science of personality way are dimensions. Okay. And now you can use these dimensions to create typologies, but you want to start with dimensions. Now, Billy, you mentioned something like, well, maybe are people born with certain kinds of tendencies to prefer certain things, okay, or be a certain way? And the answer is, if I allow for some of the, there's some folk things that I would want to say, well, it depends on what you mean by bored. But the short answer is absolutely yes. Okay, at a simple level. What do I mean by that? When you look at what's called the core personality traits, okay, there is a field of study called the Big Five. Okay, the Big Five, Jordan Peterson actually is a serious Big Five researcher. And these are the dispositional tendencies that individuals demonstrate cross-culturally. And I believe, although there is debate about this, I believe that these generally are valuable categories. What are the Big Five? Actually, this is just good to know. Okay, the acronym OCEAN allows you to categorize them. Okay, so they're openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Okay. let me give you my frame about what these are. Now, one of the things about the big five that's weird and weakens their case is that they are born originally out of empirical analysis. Okay. It's actually called the lexical hypothesis, but really interestingly, they first emerged by people analyzing words in the dictionary. And showing that they all cluster together with no theory. And then they found that there were these clusters of words of adjectives that describe people that cluster together with a lot of reliability. That's the origin of them in the original lexicon. It's called the lexical hypothesis. And notice that if there were clusters of adjectives that came out of the dictionary, there would be no theory about exactly what those traits are. And that is a historical limitation of trait theory, is that it's an empirically derived cluster as opposed to a theoretically derived cluster. But thankfully, the unified theories here, it can help bridge that empirical derivation and the variance that's accounted for with a much more theoretical one. So let's talk a little bit about what the big five are and how you can interpret them. So the first thing you want to understand is that the best way to start, I argue, is by the big two.
Okay? You're using big five, but also wouldn't IQ be one?
Yep. Okay, right. So sure. So well, that's these are traditionally noticed as sort of dispositional individual difference traits. Now, IQ is also a similar kind of dispositional difference, only that's generally considered an ability or talent. Now, there are apps, but it's a very similar, and indeed at the level of tendencies and capacities and influence of, say, genetics and environment, IQ, or really intelligence would be the preferred term, would be quite similar to the traits in this regard. So would you prefer a narrative around what IQ is, or?
Well, I wonder if there's a specific difficulty for people who maybe have high IQ of difficulty in relating to the world or something, maybe.
Sure. Actually, I can direct you then to, this was actually the topic of a podcast I did with the relational founder, Guy Senstock. He contacted me and noted that many of his people that he worked with had very high IQs, but had problems in the socio-emotional area. And he wanted to see whether I would give an analysis of that. And we spent 2 hours talking about that very problem. I can share that link with folks. Yeah, Ron is making a comment here just about Big Five. Right, he's got 2 facets. I mean, the Neo people have 5 facets in each one, but I really like, in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, the Peterson facets on the Big 10, and the 2 facets around each Big Five. It's a very helpful measure, and I think he's done some good work with that.
I just wanted to jump in and say it's 3:30. 90 minutes have passed. Thank you everyone for joining. Greg, if you have 10 or 15 more minutes to stick around.
Yeah, no, I definitely have blocked off at least till 4 o'clock, so we can you can stop the recording, and we can then we can really tell what the story is.
Before jumping into that, did you have any concluding thoughts for the recording?
Oh, actually, yeah. So
the whole series and
right, so it's a lifelong. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and share a little bit about the garden and the tree. How I think humans came to be people, culture people, as opposed to just primates, and in terms of just and hanging around with Zach Stein and Jordan Hall. Those are some really cool folks. I hope that I've been able to share at least some facets of the work that sort of fell into a rabbit hole and have maybe some insights to offer, both in relationship to how to make sense out of information, cultivate it into some serious knowledge, ground that into some big picture values, and then allow us to move in the direction of wisdom. So.
And a wholehearted gratitude from the Stoa for you being so generous with your time and spending the last moment with us. Just incredible to have you, and thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate the invite. Good to be here. It's good stuff going on here.